I do apologize for everyone having to restart.
Oh, that's not necessary, Frankie. Shit happens. Let's pick up kind of where it's hard to tell kind of where we left off. So, IP, you were speaking last, I believe. If you want to just kind of pick a spot in that last little part you were going at, and we'll just go from there and hope that they kind of sync together.
Okay, yeah, I'll start back up with okay, so regarding the testimony of Pastor Josephus, Origen doesn't cite it because, again, it would have no apologetic merit regarding his response to Celsus or trying to support his theology. It just basically mentions that Jesus existed and establishes facts Christians would have already accepted, and what seems to be the skeptics at the time would have already accepted regarding that as well. Also, there was Pseudo-Hegesippus, which quotes all of the nice things that Josephus says, that he was like a wise man, he did these wonderful works, but it doesn't quote that he was the Christ. And he's not working off Eusebius, he's working off Latin text. Eusebius is focusing on the Greek, so he doesn't actually make mention of Eusebius or whatnot. Jerome also cites the passage without it saying he was the Christ. He says he was believed to be the Christ. So there's that as well. And this passage, when we take out the obvious Christian interpolations, the overwhelming majority of scholars accept that it actually is original. It uses phrases that are distinct to Josephus. It uses a wise man. Christians probably wouldn't have used this phrase because the word he uses for wise was not distinct in their vocabulary. It denotes some sort of worldly wisdom, and they were sort of against that because they distinguish between godly wisdom and worldly wisdom in like 1 Corinthians 1, Matthew 11, Luke 10, so on and so on. It uses the phrase, those that loved him. As Robert Van Verst and Edwin Yamuchi have noted, this is typical Josephine style. Okay, as John Meyer says, it's not exactly a useful apologetic tool in addressing pagans or a useful polemic tool in Christology controversies among Christians. There's no reason for any early Christian to cite this passage because no one was really doubted that Jesus actually existed at this time. We have no direct evidence of that. So I hardly see why that would even matter regarding this. It fits with what Tacitus tells us. They both seem to be independent sources regarding the actual person of Jesus. And again, this is huge special pleading of these passages will not establish the mere existence of a historical person. This is the same way we establish other historical persons, especially in Judea from that time, like Honi the circle drawer, or the high priest Caiaphas, or, for example, Father Gamaliel, for example, one of the founders of Rabbinic Judaism. We don't have any sources contemporary with him. All are talking about him in the past. They could have just made him up, but no one is going to doubt that because that's not how history works. Same thing with someone like Hannibal, for example. All of our sources postdate his existence, and they're writing from the Roman side, for example. We could just say that the Romans made up Hannibal to give themselves credit in the Mediterranean Sea and show why they are the mightiest power. Look who they defeated, this amazing general, and they were able to destroy him. Maybe they just made him up for their uses and whatnot. No historian uses that kind of criteria. It's only when we get to Christ mythers who want to talk about historical Jesus do we start applying this special set of circumstances regarding historical investigations.
Okay, well, I mean, I feel like you're just totally disregarding any of my arguments, like about 2 Peter, how regardless of whether or not they were Christ mythers or not, you still have evidence of people that were suggesting that they were just cleverly devised stories. And so, you would have other people around the time that would doubt whether or not this Christ person actually existed. So it's not like out of the realm of possibility that people are questioning them, considering all of the evidence that we have to say that there were people that were actually questioning it at the time. And that's fine if you want to throw that particular evidence out too. But I mean, I'm not the one doing the special pleading here at all. I'm not the one that's throwing out evidence in order to support their own position. I'm not throwing out any kind of evidence for authenticity of the Testimonium Flavianum. Another thing that proves that, or at least should make you doubt whether or not it was an actual thing that Josephus wrote, is that the passages that are around it, it interrupts the flow of thought between those 2 passages. In the previous passage, you have, Pilate. He is killing Jews because they're protesting him, right? And then in the passage after it, you have Josephus saying, and about this time, another, it's like another sad thing happened or something like that, referencing the passage before it, because you just had this great commercial for Jesus right there. how is that like a sad thing if like that particular passage? Like I don't understand how that logically connects from one paragraph to another. But if you take out that passage, the thought flows seamlessly from one thought to the next thought without it having to be interrupted by that one. And the fact that the paragraph after references the paragraph before. So I mean, what I'm saying is that I'm not trying to definitively prove that the Josephus passage was inserted or anything like that. What I'm saying is that the probability is higher that it was inserted by Eusebius because of the fact that he fabricated his own church history multiple times, by the fact that he's fabricated multiple things and that we know of. So with that compiled with the fact that you could conceivably write just like Josephus would have in the perfect redacted version, mind you, but that version you could write so that it sounds like Josephus, but yet it's still out of place in that particular section. And I mean, that's just Josephus. Let's see, I do have Paul written down here. Oh yeah, that's because of the pre-existent Jesus thing that I had brought up. Paul never actually saw Jesus on earth, never experienced Jesus on earth or anything like that. He got his information from the scriptures, and even Mark, the earliest gospel, blatantly points out in the first few verses that we are pulling our information from the scriptures, being the Septuagint and all this others and all the other Jewish things. Pulling from all of that. That like it blatantly says at the very beginning of Mark, here's the prophecy. So we know that they were using prophecies. They were looking for prophecies in the Old Testament. They were waiting for the Messiah to come. It just like a few sects of Christians, a few sects of Jewish Christians, they were taking these prophecies and assuming that they either did happen or, like in the Ascension of Isaiah, they think that it already did happen in the celestial realm. And so they started writing their own cult literature about it. That's why, like with the Gospels that we have, we have at least 4 or 5 distinct Christian communities in the first century that were passing around information. Paul himself writes about how if somebody else is pushing a different gospel, then they are not actually pushing the real gospel because it's different than his. You have all of these different things that explain my reasoning for it, that has explanatory power. But I just don't see the explanatory power of like Josephus having a stroke mid writing his Antiquities of the Jews and writing something that he would not have written at all. And even if he went to the redacted version of it, I mean, that still is so out of place for him to write it there that it just doesn't make sense.
Okay, so let's go through this. Okay, when we do historical investigations, it's not just about explanatory power and scope. It's about explanatory power, scope, has to be the least ad hoc, has to be plausible, and has to provide illumination. I'm not going to argue you don't have explanatory scope or power. I'm going to argue that your theory is implausible, and it is not the least ad hoc, and it doesn't provide a lot of illumination. So, I mean, anyone can...
Okay, so basically I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So regarding that, so moving on, again, 2 Peter is a huge sort of imposing interpretation on that very vague statement about cleverly devised myth. Is he talking about pagan myths? Is he talking about myths regarding his majesty? They don't ever actually specifically say historical person, and the overwhelming majority of scholars do not do that. Again, regarding Josephus, you basically talked about it is possible. It could be. Again, it's not about possibility. It's about probability. And again, regarding Josephus's break and flow of work, that's what Josephus do. He breaks his own flow all the time. In this very passage, we're not even sure it has a good chronological order. He puts this in here because it would have a significant event during the reign of Pilate. For example, John Barclay notes in Antiquities Book 2, he says, the whole is not well structured and gives the appearance of patchwork. Okay, Seth Schwartz says of Book 20, it's historical patchwork. And then, of course, in the book, A Companion to Josephus, they say books 18 to 20 seems to be more of patchwork. The reason is because Josephus breaks his flow all the time. That's simply what he does. That's how he wrote. If you look at this exact passage on Pilate, it starts out with Pilate arriving. Pilate introduces these imperial images on the temple. He caves into the Jews, takes the shields back to Caesarea. Then he takes money to build an aqueduct. Then the testimony appears. Then he jumps to an event about some follower from ISIS in Rome, and not directly involving Pilate. Then he jumps to an account about forced Jewish scoundrels, not directly involving Pilate. Then he goes back to Pilate with the Samaritans, and then Pilate gets imperially kicked out. Josephus is patchwork as it is. If you just got to read Josephus straight through, you can clearly see that. Regarding your thing about 4 to 5 distinct communities of Christians within, I mean, if you just read the 4 Gospels, they're all basically promoting the same theology. I don't know of any scholar that it says there were this many communities in that. And even if there was, again, that's not going to threaten the passages in Tacitus or Josephus, which are more than enough to at least establish a historical person of Josephus. Again, I'm not going to defend the validity of the Gospels today or the New Testament itself. My case can be made from the hostile sources in and of itself, just for the mere existence of a historical person behind the Christian movement. For example, Rudolf Bultmann, a famous New Testament scholar, believed the Gospels were myths, agreed with you on that, and he said it's absolutely insane to deny that there was a historical person behind this. So you can accept some of the stuff you said and still believe in an historical person. And for the sake of the argument, I'm just arguing for the historical Jesus. I'm not arguing for the reliability of the Gospels today. If you want to set up that conversation, we can have that later. But for the sake of the argument, I'm just arguing there was a historical person behind the movement, regardless if there were multiple communities, even though even Bart Ehrman doesn't even take it that far, as most scholars don't. So even if that's the case, that would not challenge the case for the historical Jesus.
Okay. Well, you see, it's really incumbent upon me to have explanations for like why the Gospels are the way they are, and for me to make the claim that I'm making, I have to be able to explain like why we find so much diversity in the Gospels. I get that you're not trying to argue for the validity of the Gospels, and I wasn't making an argument for the validity of the Gospels. I was merely explaining how my claim is explained by the Gospels, because if it were to take place like I think it did, then the Gospels, the way that they appear, would make sense, the way that they're structured and the way that they're written and all of that. So I wasn't challenging you on trying to do the validity of the Bible. So I kind of feel like that's a little bit of a red herring there. And honestly, most people consider Paul to be, not necessarily part of not part of the Bible, but they feel that he is some kind of independent source because he was hostile to the Christians. So, I mean, that's why I brought Paul up. He was also writing in the 50s. I agree that Paul existed in history, and I think that those particular portions of the Bible can be used to argue for a historical, or not a historical, but a mythical Christ. So that's why those were brought up. I wasn't trying to challenge you on the reliability of either Paul or the Gospels. And basically what it boils down to is that you feel that it's more plausible that Josephus is correct and he wrote just a commercial for Jesus right in the middle of things that breaks up the flow of thought. You think that it's more plausible to do that than for Josephus to actually, flow, regardless of the patchwork of the actual events that he was talking about. The tone of both of those passages, it's somber tone with Pilate killing a bunch of Jews, and then hey, look, about this time there's a man named Jesus. He did a lot of great works. Buy our stuff, kind of thing. And then you have them talking about another sad calamity. There's like there's very different tones in all three of those parts. So what it basically comes down to, though, is at least in my the way that I see it, is that you agree with what you say is most scholars, which I will agree with you. Most scholars would think that. Okay, I'm fine with that. Like I said before, I know that I'm putting out there a hypothesis that goes against the grain of most historians now. But I would say that most historians now are using methods as far as the like proving historical Christ that aren't necessarily valid, and they're seeing the information through Christian lenses. And so, and you could tell that they argue for it too, like with you saying that I'm pushing goalposts or that I'm, special pleading on these things and whatnot. I'm really not, but that's fine if you want to think that I am, but I'm really not doing that.
Well, then I would challenge you to apply the same criteria to someone like Alexander the Great or whatnot. And in trying to argue that scholars are reading through Christian lenses is just to call them biased, and that's a distraction from the actual evidence they bring up. As regarding the Josephus breaks the flow, it's not a very happy passage. He says he died. It doesn't necessarily sound like it's a very good thing if you take out the Christian interpolation. It just says there was a guy and then Pilate put him to death, but people still believed in him and he brought over a lot of Gentiles. Anyway, let's get back to my assessment about Pilate in general. So again, you can believe in a historical person with myths. For example, there was a lot of myths about Caesar Augustus. That does not mean a person called Caesar Augustus did not exist. Again, Rudolf Bultmann believed the Gospels were myths, and even he believed there was a historical person. Just because there are myths about someone, that does not necessarily mean a historical person is not behind that. And in fact, most scholars now believe that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies about Jesus. They don't necessarily believe they're myths anymore, taking Rudolf Bultmann's old view. So, I mean, again, you can have myths about a historical person. And again, we have multiple, as Bart Ehrman noted in his debate with Bob Price, we have multiple independent sources about the existence of a person. This is the same criteria we would use to accept somebody like Hannibal, for example, who we don't have any archaeological evidence for, or somebody like, the high priest Caiaphas or Father Gamaliel, or, Honi the circle drawer. And we're not going to doubt the existence of these people for the very same criteria I'm using to show at least an historical person named Jesus existed. It's just, I don't understand why it has to be so special with Jesus when this is exactly what we use to establish the historicity of so many other people from the ancient world.
Well, I mean, I'm like I said before, I'm not special pleading. I'm not saying that Jesus is a special case. What I have argued for here is if you look at the actual text, like say of Tacitus, you will find that they are referencing like a title, or they're referencing just Christians in general. So they're not actually talking about a physical person on earth about it. And when I bring up like Paul, like I know that you're not trying to argue for the validity of the New Testament or anything like that, but Paul was a historical person that lived and was writing about the 50s. And so I think that, the fact that he says that he got his information from no man and he only got it from scripture and hallucinations is very damning evidence for the historicist position. And I would like to know, what you think about like a pre-existent idea of a Christ figure, because I know that you mentioned it before and you kind of dismissed it, but I mean, the fact that Philo of Alexandria, I mean, he mentions from Zechariah 6 of the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. Hold on, let me pull up my notes so that I get this correct. Okay, so in Zechariah 6 has a Jesus being referenced, and Philo of Alexandria explaining who this Jesus was, which Philo of Alexandria is a contemporary of Paul and was even writing before Paul. Philo explains that this Zechariah 6, Jesus was the firstborn son of God, which matches to Romans 8:29 of Paul's writings, the celestial image of God, 2 Corinthians 4:4, God's agent of creation, 1 Corinthians 8:6, and God's celestial high priest, Hebrews 2:7, 4:14, and so on. Since, Philo was a contemporary of Paul, what we have is a Jewish philosopher at the time explaining Jewish ideas about who the Son of God was, or who this Christ figure was. And the same things are being said of this Christ figure that Paul says that he hallucinated and got information from the scriptures and this hallucinated Jesus. you have both of those people that are talking from two different points of view about it, except one person thinks that that person actually came and died for sins and rose again and all that, whereas the other one doesn't think that he's even come yet. So I would love to know what you think on that particular thing, because I feel like we've really beat to death Josephus and Tacitus. I think that most of the like all of the external evidence that you could have after that, after like the let's say mid second century, is even before that though, is going to just be references to Christians existing at that time.
Okay, well, first going on back, Paul does not affect other independent sources like Tacitus, Josephus, and I know you think we've hit that to death and us, but I'm going to keep hammering that because, again, those are independent sources we have for a historical person. The same way that we have Caesar Augustus, we have historical sources for a person, that does not mean we need to believe the myths that revolved around him. Again, I'm just arguing for the historical person at this point. I'm not talking about New Testament reliability or the resurrection or of this. Now, even Bart Ehrman acknowledges that the New Testament authors thought Jesus was a divine pre-existent being. I don't see how that would necessarily affect. They still think he became an actual person regarding that. So now regarding the statement on Paul, Paul says, "For I would have known, brothers, that the gospel that was preached to me is not the man's gospel, for I did not receive it from any man. It was taught to me, but I received it through revelation of Jesus Christ." He's talking about the gospel, the actual theological message, not necessarily about the actual person of Jesus Christ. That's not necessarily to deny an actual person existed. So that would be, assuming way too much about one small little passage there. Okay, Tacitus does place Jesus in history. He places him with other historical persons, like Pontius Pilate, for example, under the reign of Tiberius. He's placing him in history. Okay, and again, you are kind of special pleading because you would not apply this type of reasoning to Caesar Augustus. You would not apply this type of reasoning to Hannibal. We could say legendary counts revolved around Hannibal. I mean, he brought elephants across the Alps. I mean, we don't even know how he would have been able to do that without modern technology today. How would he been able to have done that, for example? Maybe the Romans just invented him. Maybe that's just a legendary embellished account. No one actually denies that actually happened, or that he was at least an historical person. Myths can revolve around a person in and of itself. That's not going to threaten the case for the historical person, basically in and of itself. So I don't necessarily think that's going to affect an overall case for just an actual Jewish apocalyptic rabbi who would have existed at that time.
Okay, so let me see if I get this straight. You legit think that I only think that Christ was a myth because mythical stories circulated about him?
Is that what you're saying?
No, I have never uttered those words ever.
Well, you did say that, like the New Testament talks about him as being some sort of mythical figure or whatnot, therefore he's a myth. Again, Bart Ehrman thinks that Jesus actually existed as a person, and they were just myths that revolved around the actual historical person. I don't see how that would actually show that somebody it did not exist. But go ahead and clarify your position.
Okay, my point in bringing up the cleverly devised stories is to combat your assertion that there were no mythicists, or the historicity of Jesus didn't come up until the 17th century. It's that's what that particular thing was for. It wasn't, oh, hey, look, they're saying that there's cleverly devised myths. That means that Jesus never existed. I mean, that's never been my argument whatsoever.
Okay, well, again, regarding that passage, you're taking one sentence in 2 Peter and assuming that you know what myths they're talking about. They don't say what myths that they're talking about. They simply say, we're not following the cleverly devised myths like the pagans, or we're not following cleverly devised myths because we were eyewitnesses to his majesty. That could be talking about people maybe accusing them of myths revolving around the actual life of Jesus, not the historical person regarding Jesus. There's multiple interpretations of that. Again, we have no definitive evidence of actual Christ myths existing in the first century. And to take one passage in 2 Peter, one sentence in 2 Peter, and then say this is clearly talking about mysticists, or this is most likely talking about mysticists, is just unfounded.
why would they have written about people that were claiming they just believed clever stories if there weren't people around that were talking about it just being clever stories? Like it just doesn't make sense to me that they would just out on a limb for no reason what the fuck ever. Maybe they just had a weird hair up their ass. They were like, oh, you know what? I'm making this up now. People are talking about how we just believe in these silly ass stories.
For the same reason, for the same objections Kelsis brought up. He accused them of believing myths about Jesus, or does he use the term juggling tricks, but he still believes in an actual historical person. Again, the myth is just a very general term. It most likely refers to people confusing him of thinking Jesus resurrected or was transfigured or actually was the Son of God or whatnot. That does not doubt the existence of a historical person. Trypho didn't. Celsus didn't. So, I mean, just because you see myths in 2 Peter, that does not mean, yes, there are clearly people doubting an actual historical Jesus. I mean, Kelsis accused the Christians of believing in myths, and he still believed in a historical person.
Okay, so what I take from it is that you're using an argument from silence to say that there were no mythicists around that time. Okay, got it.
An argument from silence is used when there is one source that says something and you say, well, other sources don't say it, therefore this one source is wrong. If someone were to come and say, I believe Jesus was a Martian, we would say, no, there's no evidence of that. And they could not say, well, that's an argument from silence. No, we have zero sources of such a thing. And so that's not necessarily a fallacy to call that out. An argument from silence would only be a fallacy if we have, say, one source. Like, for example, Suetonius talks about the Jews being expelled from Rome. It'd be an argument from silence to therefore say, Josephus should have mentioned it, therefore Suetonius made it up.
Okay, I'm not saying that because there's only one particular reference to it that definitely means that it was made up or something like that. I'm saying that it's less likely that it was something that was originally there. I'm saying that it's less probable that it was actually there. So I'm in no way using an argument from silence. I'm saying that other people who had good reasons to write about things should have written about things. But when I say that, I'm not saying that as an absolute. I'm saying that as they most probably would have done it. Like, at least to me, it seems like when Suetonius wrote about, Nero burning Christians around the time of Paul's death, that he would have also mentioned, oh, hey, Nero also blamed them for burning Rome, and he tortured them too. But yet he doesn't.
Again, I don't see how that would necessarily work, because just because he didn't mention it doesn't mean he didn't believe in it. Again, why didn't Josephus mention the Jews were expelled from Rome under the reign of Claudius? Why did Ulysses S. Grant write a diary of the Civil War and never mention the Emancipation Proclamation? Why didn't Marco Polo mention the Great Wall of China? I mean, you could do this with just about any historical person. Why didn't they mention this? Why didn't they mention that? Why does Arrian tell us some things about Alexander the Great and Plutarch tells us some other things? Why didn't they agree on some of these things? I mean, you could do this with even contradicting sources. For example, take Suetonius and Plutarch's readings of the assassination of Julius Caesar. I mean, they actually contradict. Did Caesar yell out before he was stabbed or after? Did he grab the arm of the man who stabbed him in the neck or reach for his knife? Did Brutus stand over him and say something or not? Did Brutus stab him in the groin or not? Again, just because they don't mention a certain thing, that doesn't mean that it would necessarily is a valid argument. There are so many historical sources that do this. And I challenge you to sit down and read someone like Suetonius or Tacitus straight through and then compare notes on them. You're going to see differences. You're going to see silences from one and not the other. You're going to see contradictions. Like, talk about where Nero was during the fire of Rome. Suetonius tells us he was on a tower fiddling. Dio Cassius tells us he was in his palace. And Tacitus tells us he was miles away, and he even thinks that Nero wasn't even responsible for the fire. So they're not, it's just they're telling us different perspectives of what's going on. That doesn't mean a fire in Rome didn't happen. That doesn't mean a historical person behind that didn't exist either. Again, when you take the mysticist arguments and you apply them to any other area of history, any other person of history, they just fall apart.
Okay, well, I mean, for one thing, I'm not arguing for the Confederate situation that you were talking about. I'm not arguing for any of those other things. Plus, I mean, those other things would have cross references. Like, you could cross reference your information and see, which one is the one that's most reported. So, I mean, I'm still not convinced by your argument. I don't think that my particular method here actually falls apart when you apply it to other historical figures. I think that you could say that things are less probable if there's like only one source for it or anything like that. But I also don't think that you have to exactly have the exact same story in order for something to be probable. Like when your situation there with where what was it, Nero was when Rome was burning, I would say that there's three sources confirming that, or the two sources or whatnot that was confirming that he wasn't in Rome. I don't know. I didn't really research like where Nero was during the burning of Rome for that. So I'm taking you at your word on those particular recollections. So, I mean, the thing is, though, is that you can cross-reference, and the fact that we can't cross-reference Tacitus' account of Nero blaming Christians for the burning of Rome anywhere else, that kind of shifts me in the more doubting aspect of, doubting of the passage in general, but the fact that it doesn't actually say Jesus of Nazareth, like somebody would cite a historical person, is convincing for me to shift it into the realm of we don't know if this particular passage is actually talking about Jesus Christ or not. And I was really kind of hoping that we would move on to other sources or something like that, and not just continuously in a circle, argue about Tacitus and all this other stuff.
Well, I mean, if we keep bringing them up, I'm going to keep responding on those points. Now, regarding other historical persons, you don't think it's special pleading, then again, I challenge you, just go apply this to like Hannibal. Like our best source from is Livy, and he's the earliest. Cato has supposedly mentioned him, but we lost that source. So maybe Livy was just making up quotes from Cato to sort of support his argument better. Apply this to someone like Hony the Circle Drawer that no historian doubts existed. Why would we doubt his existence just because Josephus mentioned him? And the most probable person Tacitus is talking about is the only person we know that was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, who was called the Christ, who in the Romans was calling the Christus, which was virtually interchangeable as Christos at that time, as we've seen from the manuscripts and funeral inscriptions. It's the most probable explanation. And if you want to throw out other possibilities, be my guest. But at the end of the day, historians have to go on what's the most probable. We can't prove what happened in the past. We have to argue for what's the most plausible, what's the least ad hoc explanation. And given that we have multiple sources talking about someone who was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, it's most likely talking about the same historical figure.
Still, you're only talking about a title. I know that you tried to explain that earlier with, well, we only know Genghis Khan by, his title, but at the same time, we also do know what his real name was. So, I still don't find it convincing to say that Tacitus would already, be calling him just by his title, unless the people that were burning Rome or whatnot, these Christians, were going around just talking about their general beliefs. That's why I said that, at least on face value of it, there's nothing that actually cements a Christ in history. If you were to take the passage like you're wanting to take it, it only mentions a title, and it mentions a basic outline of the Christian faith. The basic outline of what Christians thought. And even, like earlier writers like Paul would have confirmed that, that is what, happened, that Pilate crucified him and all that kind of stuff. So, you're not telling us any information that actually connects him to history. Other than the fact that there were Christians that were around at that time, which I'm not even disputing in this particular. I'm not disputing that Christians were there about that time. I'm just saying that particular passage does not cement Jesus in history like you seem to think it does.
I'm gonna let you respond to that real quick, but after you respond, we're gonna kind of switch over to kind of get out of that reference point and go to, I believe, Godless, you said you had another area that you wanted to hit after this. So I will let you respond to that, and then we'll switch to that second part. Kind of keep it going.
Okay. Well, again, and you see in the New Testament, you start referring to Jesus as Christ and start associating it with his name. If Christians are running around saying the Christ has come, we follow the Christ, that's what Romans only need to know. And again, they called themselves Christians in their own works. So why would they associate him with some other name? That's sort of an argument from silence to assume that Tacitus needs to mention his actual personal name for the same reason we don't need to mention Genghis Khan to know who we're talking about, or say that Caesar crossed the Rubicon to know we're talking about Julius Caesar. We understand that from history from other sources. So, like, for example, Josephus or the Talmud mentions more about him that would collaborate with Tacitus in and of itself. So that's one thing to remember regarding that. And you could even use the Christian sources and even second century Christian sources that would collaborate with Tacitus regarding an actual historical person behind that. So we need to remember that when we're moving forward. The same stuff applies to a lot of other ancient historical people regarding that. So again, why Tacitus has no need to give us any more detail other because he's explaining what this group called the Christians associated with Nero burning them. Why would he need to give more information regarding that when his entire purpose is just to explain the origins of this group? Some Christ under Pontius Pilate was crucified. And then we have other collaborating sources which go along with that as well. So we need to remember that it's not just Tacitus, it fits in with an entire mosaic of different pieces.
Okay, Godless.
Okay, well, I mean, the only thing that I really have left to say is that as far as a historical Jesus, at least in my view, the only thing that we have really to try to cement him in history is the fact that there's a first century Jew that was turned a Christian, Paul, that admits to hallucinating a Christ figure. And, you know, given that schizotypals seem to hallucinate on a regular basis, but yet it's not so crippling that they can't function, it seems to me like the possibility that, or the probability that Paul was suffering cognitive dissonance when he was persecuting the Jews around that time. You know, he started to hallucinate this Jesus figure and got his information from there. And he elaborates and reaffirms that he gets his he does not get his information from any person on earth, that he only gets it from the hallucinated Christ that he finds. And that would be a reference earlier than the Tacitus reference that he is trying to push through here. Paul, being a historical figure and who actually did write about the Christ figure, I think the fact that, you know, he started hallucinating these things and the fact that schizotypals are welcomed and even attracted to these religious dogmatic kind of settings, I think that it's very much most likely that he hallucinated a Jesus and claimed to get information from that Jesus and glean information from the scripture in order to create his theology of his particular version of Christianity. But he wasn't the only one around. There were obviously way more Christian communities that were around at the time. We of course have the Nag Hammadi Library where you have various different Christian writings that are referencing an obvious Masonic figure around the first century. We have in the Gospels themselves, we have evidence being the two different genealogies that exist in Matthew and Luke. We have the divine Jesus, element in there that was extra, that came in from the pagans that were around at the time. You have prior to that, you have the two vastly different birth narratives, where two vastly different things happen there. With Matthew, I believe, actually mirroring the beginning of Moses' story, kind of alluding to the whole idea that the prophets of the past were like a template for the ultimate prophet of Jesus Christ. And so taking all of that into consideration, which that's a very top level kind of gleaming of the information, I feel that, it's more likely that Jesus didn't exist in the past, that he was a literary concoction because Jews were already looking for the basic idea of what Jesus would do in his life, and then proceeded to write gospels or good news about him, creating this new Jewish Christian movement.
Okay, so regarding the hallucination series, I addressed that in my resurrection series. It's a 6-part, 2 hour series where I go over that, how it doesn't necessarily fit with what Paul says. Again, Paul says he got the gospel from Jesus, not his belief in an historical person of Jesus. That's about theological messages. Okay, and we have other independent Christian sources other than Paul. We can go on the Passion narrative, which even the skeptical atheist Maurice Casey dates to the 40s. Okay, the Nag Hammadi is an extremely late collection of works. For example, the Gospel of Thomas and Nag Hammadi follows very closely with a work called the Diatessaron, which was written by Tatian around the year 1600 in Syriac. It has about 500 Syriac catchphrases in it, according to the scholarly work of Nick Perrin, and it most likely fits with very late Syriac Christianity. No, as far as I've seen, very, 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 very few scholars, like very fringe level, date the Nag Hammadi to the 1st century. It overwhelmingly dates to the late 2nd century and 3rd century. Regarding the genealogy and the early birth narratives of Jesus, I addressed that pretty extensively in my Contradictions series on my page, and we have no evidence of pagan mythology influencing early Christianity. This week I went to the library and got a book on Zalmoxis because I plan on doing a video on it. The book, it's actually out of print right now, and I'd be more than happy to talk about these alleged pagan parallels if he wants to go into that. Regarding Matthew's birth narrative, yes, I agree it's actually modeled in terms of Old Testament passages. That would not show Jesus didn't exist, because as many experts on this would note, that's what they did back in that time. They modeled a lot of the narratives in terms of in sort of already existing patterns. For example, Albert Lord would note that this is basically what a lot of times of what they did. He says traditional narratives tend to tell what happened in already existing extant patterns of stories, since the already existing patterns allow for many multiforms and are the result of often repeated human experience. Okay, he basically notes that a skilled writer would try to parallel current stories in already existing stories. For the very same reason, a preacher will get up on stage this Sunday and tell a story in his life and be like, I felt like Daniel in the lion's den, or I felt like Jesus in the wilderness. He will retell his story in terms of a biblical story in order to give it more credit, to try to sort of explain with her theological message. The biblical authors did this as well. That doesn't mean Jesus didn't exist. For example, Tacitus scholar Rhiannon Ash says Tacitus did this as well. She says he embedded such points in a very language and he used linguistic echoes and structured similarities. We see the same with Augustus. Virgil tries to paint him in a lot of Roman mythology, for example. That doesn't mean that Augustus didn't exist. Check out Social Science Commentary on the Synoptic Gospels. They say, to be able to quote the tradition from memory, to apply it in creative and appropriate ways, not only brings honor to the speaker, but lends authority to his words as well. Luke 1:68-79 is an example. It is stitched together from phrases of Psalms 41, 111, 132, 105, 106, and Micah 7. The ability to create a mosaic implied extensive, detailed knowledge of the tradition and brought great honor to the speaker who was able to pull it off. So again, even if these were just writing myths, that does not mean there was not a historical person behind there. Scholars have evaluated this extensively, and we see this in all sorts of other works. All you have to do is just read other ancient sources like Virgil or Tacitus, for example.
Hey, real quick, I think we're gonna switch it up a little bit and do a little Q&A and get some questions from the audience while there's still a little bit of time.
I would love to do that and not talk about Tacitus for another 2 hours.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it's kind of being the same thing, a little bit over and over again.
We
So we're going to try to.
We do need to have the biblical aspect of it though at some point. When we come back, so that you can argue that aspect if you want to.
Okay, so if you want to send us questions, go to our Twitter and you can message us directly with a tweet, and we'll try to get that question out there. I have a couple already that I've already given to Kyle, and I think Kyle's going to start asking those. So, Kyle, you want to ask the questions we have so far, and I will try to field some more questions if you send them to us by our Twitter, which is in the video description.
Absolutely. Okay, question number 1. What do you think is the best or strongest evidence in support of your position? I maybe want singularity examples. Whichever, Godless, we'll start with you.
Okay, for me, it would be the writings of Paul. Paul's writings are very convincing to me of my position, primarily because he, specifically states that he gets his information from scriptures and hallucinations, and that it was no physical person on earth. Now, while that doesn't 100% say that Jesus didn't exist, we don't have any firsthand accounts of Jesus. We don't have anything to say that he actually existed. We just have this already running, what is it called? Like common knowledge, I guess, just that, oh, Jesus existed. And then it turns into an like some kind of weird argument from silence or something like that. I don't know. But yeah, I would say Paul.
Okay. Happy?
Again, I could go back to the hostile witnesses, which clearly would have been happy. Celsus would have been happy if Jesus never existed. He would have used that if that was the case. He never even considers it as a possibility. Again, the Tacitus is considered one of the best historians from the ancient world. Josephus is also considered a very competent historian. They know Jesus existed when they didn't even need to. It's the overwhelming evidence there is just in the secular sources clearly shows there was at least an historical person. And, you can even, in Bart Ehrman, for example, in his debate with Bob Price, even uses Paul. He says that, Paul in Galatians 4 says Jesus was born in human fashion and he had a ministry to the Jews. In 1 Corinthians 5, he says Jesus was physically buried. Jesus was a direct descendant of King David in Romans 1:3. It refers to Jesus in a lot of human terms. So we just see that, sort of as I believe Bart Ehrman was doing this in a podcast. He says a lot of these sentences Paul brings up are sort of off the cuff. So we just have a lot of overwhelming evidence there was at least an historical person there.
Okay. The next question will be, how would your position, opinion, and arguments change if that evidence was proven, in your opinion, to be 100% false?
I'll go first. I mean, I'm happy to change my mind. I mean, I don't need Jesus to be a mythical person or anything. And actually, up until I started really looking into the possibility that he wasn't, up until that point, I was like, oh, yeah, definitely. Jesus existed in history. I mean, that was just common knowledge for me. So, I mean, for somebody to 100% definitively prove that, my Paul reference was actually talking about a physical person on earth. If that could be definitively proven, I would be fine with that being proven. I would think that there would be other bits of evidence to support that and support a physical person there on earth. But just for that particular reference, I would be fine to give it up.
And IP?
Again, I'd be happy to change my position too. I've changed my position a lot of times. I wasn't always a Christian. I changed my position regarding that. I was a dualist before I was an idealist. I've moved around my views a lot. What would they take to convince me is we'd have to find manuscripts that, maybe we found like a 4th century or a 5th century manuscript just in the sands of Tacitus that had the passage missing. Same with Josephus. Same with, all the other secular sources. We'd have to see them actually not in there and whatnot, or someone have to give definitive evidence that it was actually added to there. And, as the actual scholars of Tacitus note, it's not the case. So I would actually want to see more manuscript evidence found that would sort of show that, that these were sort of like added in later, I guess would be a good starting place. But again, there's so much evidence for the historical Jesus. It would take a lot you'd have to undo. I barely scratched the surface, actually.
Steve, that's the only two that I got that you sent. Is there any more? Can you hear me, Steve?
Oh, no, I believe that's the only two that we received. So let us know in the live chat if you sent one. If so, I did not receive it via Twitter, but I think those are the only two.
Okay, well, and in case we get one or two more, we'll go ahead and start with your closeout. If you just want to kind of wrap up your case, and then we'll see if any more trickle in and go from there. Godless, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, I guess my closing argument here would just be that, what we're left with for the earliest sources that reference Jesus is, of course, Paul, who hallucinated and got his information from scriptures. We have a 1st century Jew who is a contemporary to Paul that laid out a basic framework for what we know of the Christ figure in Christianity. We have all of the supposed prophecies from the Old Testament that we knew that Jews were looking for and trying to use in order to determine who was this Messiah, when he would come, and everything like that. We find all of these things that affirm the fact that they were looking for this Christ figure to come, and the fact that there was already a pre-existent Christ figure in the Jewish theology, I think is very compelling evidence to at least doubt that there was a historical Jesus, and want to get like hard evidence on the question of it. And I think that right now what we have in history, especially despite the fact that the church pretty much took over record keeping for their own history for hundreds of years, you would think that they would have preserved something. But I know that IP would just call an argument from silence on that. But despite all of that, we don't have any firsthand accounts of Jesus. We don't have any historical references of Jesus. We don't have a good reason at all to think that he actually existed, but we have a multitude of reasons to think that he was a literary concoction.
All right. IP.
I'll start with a quote from Rudolf Bultmann, who thought the Gospels were myths. He said, "Of course, the doubt as to whether Jesus really exists is unfounded and not worth refutation. No sane person can doubt that Jesus stands as the founder behind the historical movement." Okay, as we can see, there's numerous independent sources, as even Bart Ehrman noted in his debate with Bob Price, that all confirm there was at least an historical person. The Christians could have done so much if they wanted to invent a person. For example, Steve Mason in Josephus in the New Testament says Christian copies were quite conservative in transmitting text. They transmitted all of the works of Philo and never decided to be, devious and start adding little sayings of Jesus here and there when it could have been quite easily. We don't actually have a lot of evidence for Christians doing this. So this is just an unfounded assertion. We have dozens upon dozens. I think it was 42 sources that Habermas and Lacona calculated were within 150 years of which Jesus existed. That's a lot of different sources confirming a historical Jesus. That would be amazing if we had that for someone like Emperor Tiberius, or if we had that for somebody like Honi the Circle Drawer, or John the Baptist, High Priest Caiaphas, Father Gamaliel. The criteria we use to establish other historical people is just thrown out the window when it comes to the Jesus mysticist movement. They don't want to apply the same criteria to someone like Hannibal. They don't want to apply the same criteria to other historical figures. They have this weird sort of special movement, and they're one of their chief arguments is that the Gospels could have been missed. It could have been missed. Well, there's arguments against that, and I have videos for that. But even if they were myths, that would not show that a historical person did not at least exist. You can have myths about a historical person. So that argument is just sort of missing the entire point right then and there. So at the end of the day, there's numerous sources regarding this. Historians don't even bring this up. I mean, I believe it was Michael F. Bird who says that, the majority of scholars believe Jesus existed, and those who deny its existence are just bad historians. I'm sorry if that's what they're technically saying when it comes to what you actually ask actual historians on this matter. So at the end of the day, we just have too many sources to deny an actual historical person behind the Christian movement existed.
Okay. I want to thank both of you guys for taking the time to come out and do this. I think that there's enough left here to probably do three more of these probably, since we only got to one aspect of it. But real quick before we head out, I want to say that tomorrow we're going to be having our Ad Hominem live show. That's going to be at 9:00, and we're going to do a pseudoscience Sunday, and that's going to be with Debbie Duran. She is kind of new to YouTube, but she has an interesting view on the way that the universe is. It's not what you think it is. And to discuss that with her, we have Kirsten Banks, who is a astrophysics student in Australia. She also is an educator at the largest observatory over in Australia. So she will be joining us to kind of walk through Debbie's view on the universe. It will be really interesting, so you don't want to miss that. Also, on Wednesday, we'll be having another debate show. This time it will be on the influence that religion has on society, and that's going to be with Skylar Fiction and Steve. I was looking for the guy's name just a second ago. Can you help me with that?
I get it to you in just 1 second.
Yeah, we found a guy yesterday. He reached out to us, and he has a very extensive philosophy background. We think that it's a good matchup that's going to go really well with kind of what Skylar's channel is about and those conversations wise. So that'll be really good. But his name escapes me, so we'll find that out.
His name is Dustin Crummett. He's a philosopher specializing in the philosophy of religion.
Yeah. So that will be really good. That'll be Wednesday at 9:00, and that will be on the positive influence that religion has in society. And then on Friday the 13th in April, join us for the Kent Hovind roast. That will be at 8:00 on Friday the 13th. So that'll be fun. But yeah, thank you guys again. That was awesome. You guys did both fantastic, and thank you to all of you guys out there for watching. Steve, you have anything else?
I don't. I want to thank both these gentlemen for joining us today. This was actually very spirited, very educational. I am going to be the first to say that most of this went over my head, so I might have to watch it again. But I think a lot of people that did understand this topic got a lot out of it from both sides. I think both of you guys came very prepared. So I do thank you for that. I want to thank the people watching. We had a lot of people paying attention to this. This was something that people had wanted to see for quite some time. And I think that Kyle is right. There's so much to talk about in this that may not be the first time this discussion takes place, because I think that this could have not just part 1 and part 2 due to technical difficulties, but actually part 3 and part 4 dealing on this topic. So I want to thank you guys for watching. Thanks for tweeting out all the links to this, and thanks for supporting the Non Sequitur show, including the people that have donated. And by the way, we do have Streamlabs now. Super Chat will not be active for another month, unfortunately. YouTube is backlogged. So we do have Super Chat. We do appreciate, Streamlabs, and we do appreciate everybody that supported us by that method. With that,
check out the Faithless Forum.
Check out the Faithless Forum. That is April 7th?
7th, yes.
Yay, awesome. And with that, I think we're going to bid you a good night. Oh, real quickly, Goddess Cranium's having a discussion with Arn Ra on his channel. Go check it out. And we will be on the Geek Room at, what is it? Hour from now?
Yeah, an hour.
It's 8:23. We start at 9:00 Eastern Standard Time.
So 9:00. 9:00 Eastern Daylight Time. See you guys. We'll be there on the Geek Room tonight.
See y'all. Hey,